fried rice, jollof rice, coconut rice, rice and beans, rice and peas, rice and stew, fried plantain, oxtail, roti. The foods that I mentioned are the foods that I grew up eating, and perhaps you grew up eating similar foods as well. But today you will rarely find me eating any of those foods. And that's what I want to talk about today, is whether our cultural foods have been leading us down a path of destruction health-wise. Number one, you might say not necessarily, because the foods that we eat are full of great nutrients. For example, vegetable stew is something I grew up eating. This is native to the Yoruba people of West Africa. It is packed full of a lot of great food, including protein, spinach or collard greens, tomatoes, red peppers, onions. For some, they like to use garlic and ginger in the food. But even though it's packed full of great and fresh ingredients, there are some ways in which we prepare it that might not necessarily be good for us. Number one, some of us like to fry our protein, meaning meat or fish, in oil. We like to deep fry it for flavor. We also like to use things like palm oil or canola oil also for flavor. And then third, we tend to eat vegetable stew, for example, with a very heavy carb like semolina or eba. And eba is cooked garri. Garri has a very high glycemic index. Because it has a high glycemic index around 87 is what I could find when I did some research. And so when you eat something with such a high glycemic index, it has a potential to raise your blood sugar or spike your blood sugar fairly rapidly after you ingest it. And this is not good for people with prediabetes or diabetes, for example, or for somebody who's trying to monitor their blood glucose levels. But you might be saying, well, our ancestors ate similarly and they cooked the food and they didn't have any issues, so why are we now having issues? We need to put into context why the food that our ancestors ate isn't necessarily the food that we're eating today. So first, let's talk about genetic modification. So this is where crops are now bred for specific traits like size, disease resistance, and longer shelf life, potentially altering taste and nutritional value. Now, some of you might remember growing up and keeping food for no more than 3 days inside of the house. However, now with deep freezers and preservatives that are added to our food and food that is genetically modified to grow faster and bigger, we find that it is very different from what our ancestors used to eat. Long gone are the days where we go shopping for food every 3 days if it's not like a fresh vegetable or things of that nature. It's like we need to pile and stock our fridge full of food and our freezers full of food. And honestly, I understand. If you're a busy person, you don't have time to go out and get food every 3 days. You have to stock up so that it will be convenient for you in your busy lifestyle. Another thing that we need to think about and put into context is industrial farming. So this is where you have large-scale farming practices with heavy reliance on fertilizers and pesticides. And honestly, those are the things where we become most concerned with, is modified food that is heavily processed. And if you don't really have access to organic or the funds to buy organic, then you are relying upon these types of food that use heavy pesticides and fertilizers and things of that nature. Now, we also talk about globalization. Most of our ancestors weren't eating food from different parts of the world. Yes, through migration, you have foods that were introduced from one culture to another culture, but often it was still made, grown, and processed right there on the land. However, depending on where you live, you're getting food that's imported from all over the world. And that's another thing. With globalization, food from different parts of the world are readily accessible, leading to a wider variety of ingredients that are introduced that, are pretty much used to preserve the food as they cross the seas to get to your plate. And then we're also talking about consumer demands. So this is convenience and affordability, often drive food choices, leading to preferences for processed food and longer shelf life. So some specific examples that I want to provide you today are fruits and vegetables. So often we are looking at cross-pollination and genetically modified food so that you're having often larger pieces of fruit and vegetables that are more uniform in appearance and that might have a slightly different taste to the original type of fruit or vegetable. And then we're also talking about meat. So we're talking about animals that are raised fairly fast and quickly. And this is because we want to mass produce meat and get it out there to the table or to the freezer fairly fast. And I talked about this earlier about how cows are given a particular hormone to increase milk production while they're actually breastfeeding their calves. This is because female cows have a very short period of lactation. It's about 8 months, where it's seen as a prime opportunity for farmers to get more milk out of the cow, is to give them this hormone, and that increases milk production. We also know that animals are pumped full of hormones to get them to grow faster so that we can consume them fairly fast. And then bread is another one. Bread often has ingredients and preservatives that are introduced because manufacturers wanted to have a longer shelf life. And also we want to keep food as long as possible. So there is a bag of bread sitting on your table that has been there for, I don't know, a month, and you don't see any mold, you don't see it beginning to turn bad. And some of you might not be concerned about that. Some of you might be saying, well, something has to give, and if it's the bread that's going to sit on the table for a month without going stale or without going bad, well, then that'll be it. You know, there's only so much you can take with your busy lives and with whatever else is going on in your life. And I understand that, but I want us to think a little bit about that. If there are things that we can do differently to help us get past the danger zone of eating so much food that is filled with preservatives and filled with hormones and just prepared poorly. So that being said, you might be saying, well, sis, what's the remedy? What can we do differently? And I think you need to put it into context. When we're talking about changing our food choices, it's because we want to be healthy. We don't want to experience obesity or hypertension or diabetes or cardiovascular disease or any other ailments that can be tied to food, essentially, that can be tied to highly manufactured, ultra-processed food that aren't really good for us. These foods can be high in sugar, high in sodium, and things of that nature. So let's talk about one of the first things you can do is how you prepare your food is going to be key. Instead of frying your meat or your fish or your tofu, why not think about putting it in the oven or putting it in the air fryer? Some of you might say, well, the air fryer is it's worse than frying in oil, but that's up to you. But I would still say consider using that over the oil and deep frying that, because the oil has been proven to not be as good for us because of the free radical releases, because of the high fat content and things of that nature. Another thing we can think about is actually reducing the amount of salt and sodium and sugar we introduce into our food. If it's not naturally in the ingredient, do we need to add so much? I know a lot of us use seasonings that are full of salt and it adds flavor to the food, but think of other ways you can season your food. Think of other ways you can add flavor to your food that don't necessarily spike your blood glucose or your blood pressure. So think about seasoning with onion powder, garlic powder, curry, paprika, cumin. Try to investigate what flavors might satisfy your palate. Another thing we should think about is, can we swap out canola oil and vegetable oil for olive oil, for example? I know there's a lot of debate about seed oils and whether that's good for you or not. I don't really have an opinion on that right now because I haven't done that much research on seed oils, but I know for a fact that olive oil has a higher melting point and it is a bit more healthier for you to consume compared to canola oil or vegetable oil or palm oil, for example. Another thing I want you to consider is, if you must eat your traditional foods, which I'm not against our cultural foods, I cook it in my home too, but do you have to eat it every day? Is there a way for you to consume it no more than 3-4 times a week? You know, is it absolutely a must that you have to eat these foods? Perhaps it's your lifeline. You must eat the traditional foods because that's what keeps you going. That's what satisfies you. That's what fills your hunger. And you know, in that case, I would say try to prepare your foods a little bit differently, a little bit more health consciously, so that you can enjoy the food and be healthy at the same time. So again, I'm not here to bash our cultural food. Like I said before, I still prepare it in my home, but I prepare it differently than what I grew up eating, and that is because I want to remain as health conscious as possible. So let me know in the comments, do you eat your cultural food, or have you completely banished your cultural food? And what do you do to make it more healthier for you? Have you changed up your preparation routine so that it is suiting you and your family more? I'm interested to know. And I'm also interested to know, what were the foods that you grew up eating? Let me know in the comments if they were similar to what I grew up eating. I'm also going to put a call to action that if you have any topics that you want me to discuss on this channel, please also leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to research and follow up with you on what I find. I do thank you for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.